Imagine you're a soldier in 1890. You've got rifles, cannons, and the full backing of the most powerful empire on Earth. You're walking into West Africa feeling like an absolute legend, like this battle will be easy. But then the forest goes quiet, too quiet. No birds, no wind, nothing. And suddenly, the trees start shaking. Birds burst into the air, flying, scattering, escaping. And then thousands of women explode out of the forest, sprinting straight at you with machetes, with muskets, and absolutely no fear, no hesitation, no warning, just war. Yeah, history didn't tell you this part. That's not fiction. That actually happened. And the men who survived went home and told everyone, and nobody believed them. Today, we're talking about the Agojie, the Dahomey Amazons, the most elite, most feared, most overlooked fighting force in African history. And every single fact in this story gets more insane than the last. Let's set the scene. The kingdom of Dahomey, modern-day Benin, West Africa, somewhere around the 17th century. The king decides his palace needs protection, so he forms a corps of female elephant hunters called the Ghezo. These women were already deadly. They hunted elephants for sport. Elephants for sport. Over time, that role evolves. The women move from palace guards to frontline soldiers. They are given ranks, weapons, commanders. By the 1800s, they are no longer just bodyguards. They are the backbone of Dahomey's entire military. At their peak, around 4,000 to 6,000 women soldiers, out of a total force of about 10,000. The women weren't the backup plan. They were the plan. But here's where it gets interesting, because this wasn't just tradition, it was strategy. And that strategy changed everything about the kingdom's power. Here's the real origin story nobody talks about. In Dahomey, women living in the king's palace could not marry outside. They could not leave. They were essentially bound to the palace. So instead of letting thousands of women remain idle, King Agojie makes a decision. Train them, arm them, make them lethal. Think about that. He transforms a social constraint into a military superpower. These women had no divided loyalties, no husbands to go home to, no external political ties. The king was their entire world, and in return, they received status, pay, alcohol rations, and social respect that most men in the kingdom didn't even have. They became known as the Mino, which means our mothers. And that name matters, because you do not mess with someone's mother, especially not when she's holding a machete. Speaking of weapons, you are not ready for what these women actually trained with. Forget push-up and normal military training. The Agojie training was designed to erase fear from the nervous system. Completely, they ran through thorn bushes, bare skin, to build pain tolerance. They wrestled, they practiced full raid simulations, sometimes with live captives. They were trained to execute prisoners quickly, without hesitation. They fasted for long periods. They trained in extreme conditions: heat, endurance, pain. One European observer wrote that they excelled male soldiers in strength and ferocity. Another noted that their coordination looked like a professional standing army, because it was. And the discipline? Merciless. If you showed cowardice, you were removed, not demoted, removed. And the social shame of leaving was considered worse than dying in battle. That tells you everything about the culture these women operated in. They weren't just trained to fight. They were trained to be psychologically unbreakable. And that psychological edge, it showed up in a very specific way when they went to war. The Agojie weren't just brave, they were strategic. Their signature move was the dawn raid. Hit the enemy while they're asleep, disoriented, and half-dressed. Move fast, strike hard, don't give anyone time to think. They specialized in flanking maneuvers, meaning attacking from multiple directions at once. They used dense formations that could punch through enemy lines, and they were extraordinarily well-armed. Curved swords, clubs, and machetes, each warrior typically carrying multiple weapons, depending on the mission. But here's what separated them from other armies of the era. They operated as a unit, completely synchronized. European military observers recorded something shocking, that their battlefield coordination rivaled anything they'd seen in Europe. These weren't warriors just charging in on emotion. This was structured warfare, highly trained, highly disciplined, extremely effective. Now here's where history gets uncomfortable, because what the Agojie were actually doing when they weren't fighting outside enemies, that part deserves its full honest spotlight. Real history doesn't give you perfect heroes. It gives you people, and people are complicated. The Dahomey Amazons are no exception. The Kingdom of Dahomey was deeply involved in the transatlantic slave trade. They carried out raids on neighboring villages and rival kingdoms. People were captured, families torn apart, and those captives were sold into the transatlantic slave trade through the port of Ouida. Dahomey became one of the most active African participants in that system. And the Agojie, they were the ones on the front lines, the force that made those raids possible. Now, this doesn't erase who they were, their discipline, their skill, their power as warriors. But it does mean we have to face the full picture, because both things are true. They were elite, highly trained, fearless women in a deeply patriarchal world, and at the same time, they were part of one of the greatest atrocities in human history. That tension, that's real history, not a highlight reel, not a legend. Understanding that difference, that's what separates storytelling from truth. Now, let's get back to the story, because when Europe finally showed up looking for a fight, that's when everything changed. By the late 1800s, France was expanding across West Africa, collecting kingdoms like trading cards. Dahomey was on the list. In 1890, the First Franco-Dahomeyan War broke out. France sends modern rifles, artillery, a professional colonial army. Dahomey sends the Agojie. What followed shocked them. Ambushes, night attacks, close combat fighting. The French expected a quick victory. Instead, they were dragged into brutal warfare. French commanders sent letters describing the female warriors as the most dangerous fighters they encountered. Then in 1892, round 2. France returned stronger, better equipped, more aggressive, and even more troops. The battles at Cotonou and Dogba were brutal, and when the Agojie ran out of ammunition, they didn't retreat. They fought with knives in hand-to-hand combat against a heavily armed European colonial force. They suffered devastating losses, but they held on until the kingdom eventually fell. The French eventually won, but it cost them far more than they'd planned. And the stories French soldiers told afterwards, they haunted European military circles for years. Here's something they don't really put in the textbooks. Many French soldiers who fought the Agojie came back deeply disturbed, not just physically, but mentally. Why? Because European military training at the time was built on one core assumption: you're fighting men. The colonial mindset was already dehumanizing enough, but fighting women who matched them, outmaneuvered them, and refused to stop. That broke something in those soldiers' worldviews. Some of them refused to talk about it. Others described being frozen, just watching the Agojie charge at dawn. One French officer Henri Morienval wrote that fighting the Dahomey women warriors was unlike anything in his military experience. Their ferocity, he said, felt almost supernatural, and he didn't mean that as a compliment. He meant it as a man who was genuinely afraid. And the psychological warfare, that wasn't accidental. The Agojie knew the effect they had. They built that fear deliberately. They turned their reputation into a weapon, and they used it masterfully. Now here's the twist almost nobody knows, because after the kingdom fell, the story didn't end there. When Dahomey fell to France in 1894, the formal Agojie were officially disbanded. France wasn't about to leave a standing army of elite female warriors around, understandably. But the story didn't end there. Some Agojie survived, kept training, carried the identity forward quietly. The last known surviving Agojie was a woman named Nawi. She was interviewed by a journalist in 1978. She claimed to have fought in the 1892 war against France, which would have made her well over 100 years old. At the time of the interview, she died in 1979. Think about that timeline. A woman who fought in a 19th century colonial war was alive when man landed on the moon. She lived through the entire 20th century and carried the memory of the Agojie with her to the very end. That's not just history, that's legacy. Speaking of which, here's how the world finally started paying attention to this story in the way it deserved. For most of modern history, the Agojie were barely mentioned. Then fiction changed perception. Then the Black Panther franchise introduced the Dora Milaje, fictional warrior women clearly inspired by the Agojie. Millions of people worldwide saw them and asked one question: was this real? Yes, extremely real. And then in 2022, the film The Woman King, starring Viola Davis, brought the Agojie directly into mainstream consciousness. The film grossed over $67 million. Viola Davis trained for months, gained muscle, learned combat choreography, and called it one of the hardest roles of her career. Suddenly, academic papers, documentaries, museum exhibitions, a military history that had been minimized was finally getting the scale of attention it deserved, all because the story was always extraordinary. It just needed someone to tell it loudly enough. Here's the big picture takeaway. The Dahomey Amazons aren't just a cool history story. They challenge everything most people think they know. The idea that African kingdoms were primitive or passive, wrong. Dahomey had structure, strategy, power, a real military system with hierarchy and international trade. The idea that women in the past had no agency, no influence, also wrong. The Agojie had rank, they had pay, they had legal status, and real authority. In fact, in many cases, they held more power than most men around them. And then there's the biggest assumption of all, that colonization was some kind of clean, inevitable march of progress. It wasn't. It was violent. It was costly, and it was resisted fiercely by people who fought with everything they had, right up to the very last moment. Yes, the Agojie lost to France, but losing a war doesn't mean losing your legacy. These women trained in thorns, they raided at dawn, they held rifles with bleeding hands, and stood face to face with one of the most powerful empires on earth, without flinching. They didn't need Europe to remember them. They remembered themselves. And now, the whole world does too. So that's the Agojie, one of the most powerful and most overlooked forces in history. and somehow, most people have never even heard of them. Let me ask you, which part shocked you the most? The training, the wars with France, or Naui, a warrior from the 1800s, living all the way to 1979? Be honest, which one made you pause? Drop it in the comments. I'll go through every comment, and if this changed how you see history, even a little, you're going to love what's coming next, because this story, it's just the beginning. Hit subscribe, new videos every Saturday, and the next one that might change everything you thought you knew.